Welcome to this briefing on the basics of K-12 public education in the United States. The briefing makes 4 key points: that the purpose of public education is contested, the system is highly decentralized, how well our schools are doing depends on who you ask, and improving our schools is a serious management challenge. When you finish watching this series of videos, you should have a better understanding of why the system works the way it does, and be better able to anticipate how new change efforts might unfold. The briefing is organized in 4 parts, each posted as a separate recording. This is part 1. The purpose of public education is contested. One of the things that makes public education policy and leadership tricky from the start is that public schooling does not have one clear and accepted purpose, at least not once you get beyond the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Here, I highlight 5 categories that capture many of the different perspectives of philosophers, policymakers, and citizens. As you read them, think about how differently you might organize a school system or even a single child's experience of learning based on which of these you prioritize. For example, if you're more concerned with education's role in strengthening and improving society, you might agree with philosopher George Counts that the social needs of the age trump the individual needs of the child. Whereas, if you're more concerned with the well-being and development of the child, you might prefer that schools are responsive to the growth, interests, and ideas of each child as an individual. If you prioritize preparation for employment, you might be concerned that education is developing marketable skills and is responsive to changing workforce needs. Whereas, if you prioritize developing the mind, you might worry that vocationalism undermines the academic tradition of learning present, for example, in the liberal arts. These goals compete for time and resources, and sometimes are in clear opposition to one another. In a public system funded by taxpayers and overseen by elected officials, it is not surprising that these different emphases push and pull, ebb and flow, compete for time and resources, and change based on contemporary circumstances. Despite the lack of consensus about what the most important goal is for our public schools, there has been widespread support in the United States for the maintenance of a free system of public schools, according to Corcoran and Gertz cited on the slide. As this graph shows, the 20th century was a period of dramatic expansion of access and educational attainment. Take a look at 1900. At the turn of the century, just 6% of Americans graduated from high school. Today, the U.S. high school graduation rate is over 80%, the highest ever. Lynn Olson has written that if one word could summarize American education in the 20th century, that word would be more. Today, there are more students attending school for more of the year and for a longer period of their lives than at any time in our history. Over the course of this century of expansion, different goals rose to the top during different periods. In her book, Schooling America, Patricia Graham organizes the prevailing goal of 20th century public education into 4 distinct periods: assimilation, adjustment, access, and achievement. While it is interesting to understand these shifts, and I recommend digging into it more deeply on your own, what is probably more important for our purposes here is to consider a few overarching ideas relevant to thinking about how change efforts unfold. I'll focus on 3 of these. First, the education system has changed, proving its ability to shift and respond to changing societal demands. But also that this change has never been as complete as its proponents would have liked. As Graham writes, schools have not adjusted to the new musical scores with alacrity. They are typically just starting to master the previous drummer's music when new drummers appear. And third, that the basic features of the management model of our schools that we are familiar with today and that many of us experienced, from separating children by age to the typical high school bell schedule to standardized testing, took hold in the first half of the 20th century and have largely persisted through each of these periods of change. While access and attainment in U.S. public education boomed in the 20th century, outpacing other nations, access was not equal. Black and brown Americans and their allies have fought for access to quality education throughout American history and continuing through the present. And access to schooling varied based on class and region. Graham writes, "Traditionally, we have been satisfied with the excellent academic performance of a few, including some rich and a few poor, some white and a few of color. For the remainder, we have settled for much more modest achievements." Comparatively, at least, in the 21st century, Americans are concentrating their educational energies on improving the academic achievement of all our youth. This is reflected in the goals of school districts today. Today, the commonly communicated priority is college and career readiness for every child. This slide shows the public vision statements of 3 large city school districts communicating this goal. You can see that their vision has moved far beyond what would have seemed like a tremendously ambitious one early in the last century: high school for all. They are clear today that every student should graduate high school ready for college. Graham writes, "During the last half century, we have come to believe that schooling is not complete without college." In 1996, President Clinton said, quote, "Our goal must be nothing less than to make the 13th and 14th years of education as universal to all Americans as the first 12 are today." Consistent with this expanded vision, one survey found that by 2000, 87% of Americans agreed that a college diploma had become as important as a high school diploma used to be. On one hand, this higher bar and expanded vision reflects the positive influence of reformers who have emphasized the belief in all children's potential, viewed education as a critical civil rights battleground, and pushed the system to take responsibility for the success of all children, regardless of race, poverty, or academic background. It also reflects a recognition of the demands of a modern economy in which the disparity in economic outcomes between college graduates and those with a high school diploma has never been greater in the modern era. This vision is consistent with a popular narrative that the economy has changed and the rest of the world has caught up. If all students are not prepared for higher level, higher skilled jobs, they will struggle to compete in a globally competitive economy, compromising their own futures and the future of the nation as a whole. Grubb and Lazarson refer to this widely accepted line of argument as the education gospel. But some critics question the unintended effects of this narrative, from pushing unprepared students to accumulate burdensome college debt to letting other areas of society off the hook by holding education up as a panacea, thereby providing, quote, rhetorical justification for keeping government out of broader economic and employment policies. This closes the first section of our briefing. As we close, think about how an organization behaves if it has a clear and widely accepted purpose or priority, compared to an organization that has different competing goals and shifting priorities over time. How might that difference influence how those organizations respond to the needs of their stakeholders and how change unfolds in that context? Also, think about the goals of public schools from your perspective. What do you believe is the most important mission of public education? How do you reconcile the difference between things like child-centered learning and the broader needs of society?